Shalom, and welcome to Israel Policy Pod. My name is David Halperin. I'm the CEO of Israel Policy Forum, filling in today for our regular host, Neri Zilber, so that I can interview our regular host, Neri Zilber, of course, Israel Policy Forum's policy advisor and independent journalist, who last year, about a month after the October 7 attacks, published an article in the Financial Times entitled "Dead Men Walking: How Yahya Sinwar Deceived Israel." And so in the aftermath of the rather shocking development of Yahya Sinwar being killed as a result of a regular IDF patrol in southern Gaza, there really is no one better to speak to about the life of Yahya Sinwar, the disaster that he brought to the region, and what may come next than our colleague Neri. So Neri, thank you for coming on Israel Policy Pod, for letting the tables be turned.
First of all, it's an honor and a privilege to come on with you, David. You're the boss, so I couldn't really say no. But yes, momentous days. Interesting development late last week, as you said, really out of the blue, the demise of Yahya Sinwar, the violent life and death of what can only be described, as you put it, a person who brought disaster on the region, who obviously brought disaster on Israel and thousands of people, especially in southern Israel on October 7th, and brought disaster on his own people, especially in Gaza. There's not too much good to say about the man, but he is a world historical figure that won't soon be forgotten, despite his death last week.
So you've been covering him for quite some time, and I wonder if you could just answer this question that you wrote about a year ago. How did Sinwar deceive Israel? And who was he? How do we track his rise and now this ultimate fall?
So you're right. Yahya Sinwar, my relationship with Yahya Sinwar, if you can call it that, didn't start on October 7th. It went back many, many years. This is one of the frustrating things about October 7th and the aftermath of people kind of following the ongoing war, that they woke up in the morning and heard about this violent individual responsible for October 7th. I've been tracking him at least since 2017, when he took over really leadership of Hamas in Gaza. And he was really the figure for Hamas in Gaza, in the personalized nature of Middle East politics, and even especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was really all about, okay, what is Sinwar thinking? What is Sinwar going to do? Why did he do that move and not the other move? And it's not just me talking like this. When you sat down with Israeli military and political leaders, that's how they talked. Sinwar this, Sinwar that. So he was really a formative figure, an influential figure even before October 7th. But his rise, look, the biography will kind of do back of the envelope. He was born in Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, in the refugee camp there in the 1960s. He was just short of his 62nd birthday when he was killed last week. So not that old, all things considered. And he came from really the same street almost as Mohammed Def, the head of the Hamas military wing, the Izzeddin al-Qassam brigades, and Mohammed Dahlan, a rival figure from the Fatah movement that controls the Palestinian Authority. And really, he got a start in the 1980s as kind of this advisor, whisperer in the ear of Ahmed Yassin, the wheelchair-bound sheikh, the founder of Hamas. So he's really close to Yassin, and he was given responsibility back in the 1980s by Yassin to essentially go after collaborators, and really suspected collaborators, within Palestinian society in Gaza. And you can call him really the first secret police chief of Hamas. And he had a really violent reputation. That's how he earned the nickname the Butcher of Khan Yunis. It wasn't a nickname given to him by the Israelis. It was actually given to him by Palestinians. And he deployed very, very violent, very ruthless methods to dispatch these many victims. He's at least confirmed and even admitted to killing 12 people personally. We suspect there are many, many more. In one instance, I sat down for that article for the Financial Times that you alluded to with the Shin Bet interrogator, who actually sat down for many hours with Sinwar after Sinwar was arrested by the Israelis in 1989. And Sinwar essentially told him the story of how he brought this collaborator and brought the collaborator's brother to this place. And he made the brother of the suspected collaborator essentially kill his own brother, buried him alive with a spoon, one spoon full of sand after another. So that's really Yahya Sinwar, the butcher of Khan Yunis. But like I said, he was arrested pretty early in 1989 and spent pretty much the next 2 decades in Israeli prison. And his time in Israeli prison wasn't idle. So he eventually rose to be the head of all Hamas prisoners in Israeli jails, which is actually a pretty influential position inside Hamas itself. I got a hold of a handwritten copy of the debrief by the Shin Bet of Sinwar, and the characterization of Sinwar, obviously accurate back then, but tells you a lot about the current moment and how he got there. They called him and described him as a cruel, an influential person, cunning, manipulative, has the ability to carry crowds, is charming, but also very restrained and with unusual abilities of endurance. So really kind of a ascetic individual, very intense, very private, a man of few words, and very well respected by the other prisoners in jail. And that's how he got that position. The other thing he did in Israeli jail was study Hebrew. So Sinwar was a fluent Hebrew speaker, a political junkie, if you will, always followed Israeli politics very closely. According to my information, he read books in Hebrew about pretty much all the significant Israeli and Zionist leaders, going back to Jabotinsky, but also Begin and Rabin. He read it all. And he really knew, or at least he thought he knew, Israeli society, Israeli politics really well. And so when he was released from Israeli prison in 2011 as part of the exchange deal for Gilad Shalit, the hostage Israeli soldier, Sinwar deployed all those abilities I just mentioned. And by the way, the Gilad Shalit deal, in retrospect, obviously quite controversial, even though at the time it enjoyed, overwhelming support inside Israel. And the price was very high, though. Over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, especially pretty serious ones, pretty heavy ones, released for one Israeli soldier. And the thing about the Shalit deal is that number one on Hamas's list of released prisoners was Sinwar. It was Sinwar. So he knew that if there was going to be any deal, he would be released. And he was released back to Gaza, like I said, in 2011, and pretty quickly rose up the ranks of the organization. Initially, it was kind of this go between the political arm of Hamas in Gaza and the military wing of Hamas in Gaza. But by 2017, he essentially was voted and became the political leader of Hamas for the entire Gaza Strip. Obviously, a Gaza Strip controlled by Hamas. And since then, really, he deployed what I called, to be clear, definitely before October 7th, the Sinwar doctrine. And this gets to your initial question, how he deceived Israel for so many years and caught Israel really unaware on the morning of October 7th. The Sinwar doctrine for many years was essentially the calibrated use of force against Israel to essentially extract concessions from Israel, primarily economic and financial concessions. This was what I dubbed the Sinwar doctrine, and it was really successful. So, kind of sporadic rocket fire. Our listeners may remember these kind of incendiary kites going over the border and torching Israeli farmland in the Gaza envelope. In 2017, he launched or co-opted and then launched these kind of mass demonstrations, mass riots on the Gaza border. Every Friday, I was down there, and so on and so forth. And it was successful. That's the thing. He got from Israel things that nobody ever thought Hamas would be able to extract from Israel, like thousands of work permits for Gazans to go into Israel once again and work there. Mm-hmm. Qatari money. He even at some point, with Israeli kind of quiet assent, got a commercial border crossing opened between Gaza and Egypt. Not the Rafah crossing, but a separate border crossing between Gaza and Egypt. And they essentially were moving in whatever they wanted with minimal Egyptian kind of inspection. So he was quite successful at doing this, and the situation did improve in Gaza. I mean, it was still not a great economic situation in Gaza. Also, we have to remember Hamas siphoned off billions to build up its military and to build all those tunnels. But it was working, but it lulled Israel into a false sense of not only complacency, but essentially they got Sinwar and Hamas completely wrong. They thought Hamas was deterred. They thought Hamas and Sinwar were more interested in kind of the internal situation inside Gaza and weren't really interested in a major escalation with Israel. And that's how really October 7th happened. He lulled Israel to sleep.
Yeah, it seems like the strategy that was working was exactly that, is creating this image that what he was actually after were things like work permits and economic inducements and general pragmatic goals at keeping the situation stable, rather than, as you rightly say, lulling Israel to sleep. I'm curious, clearly I understand there's been intelligence now that this strategy was all laid out to bear. I wonder if you can speak a bit on what we have learned about how meticulous Sinwar's planning was leading up to October 7th. And then I want to talk about, of course, where has he been? Where do we now know that he has been since October 7th, and how he survived for nearly a year?
Yeah, so obviously two great questions. Look, the planning for October 7th took years, right? It wasn't just that he sent, thousands of Nukba commandos across the border. They had to coordinate thousands of rockets being fired at the same time that morning and all throughout the day, thousands of rockets. They had drones kind of taking out Israeli border technology, essentially. There's even speculation that Hamas launched cyber attacks to blind Israel. They gathered intelligence about the kibbutzim on the border. They gathered intelligence about various IDF army bases. I mean, this was a major military operation that required massive amounts of planning and resources that they brought to bear. And on their terms, it worked, maybe better than they could have ever hoped. But that was the plan for what we saw unfold on October 7th. And we should mention, he wasn't alone in this. He was the mastermind of October 7th, but Mohammed Deif, the head of the Qassam Brigades, the military wing, was also there every step of the way. And a lot of Sinwar's power came from Mohammed Deif. Like I said, they grew up together. And so he essentially had the backing and the support of the Qassam Brigades, that not only in terms of Sinwar's own rise, but also to unleash October 7th. And really, if we're talking about Israel getting Sinwar wrong and considering him kind of a pragmatist that you could do business with, which Israel was doing business with Sinwar, especially there was only one prime minister at the time, under Bibi Netanyahu. He was anything but a pragmatist. I mean, he declared total war on Israel on October 7th, and that shouldn't be kind of lost in the shuffle. Now, October 7th happened, and I think understanding Israeli society, I don't think he was necessarily surprised by Israel's reaction, Israel's very severe reaction to October 7th. To the best of our understanding, he quickly went underground into Hamas's kind of vast tunnel network that they had built over years and literally poured billions of dollars into that project. We understand, according to people I've spoken to, he was in the tunnels under Khan Yunis in southern Gaza since really the beginning of the war, by the way, along with his family. So his family was safe, and maybe some of our listeners have seen the pictures released by the IDF, but they had kind of these big cavernous subterranean rooms, couches, and a plasma TV. So Sinwar could obviously follow the 8 o'clock Israeli news. Very important for him. Kitchens, bathrooms, stocked with food. So they were safe underground, while obviously above ground, the Gazan people were suffering greatly for his decision. At a certain point, but really after Israel launched the kind of southern front of its ground operation in Gaza in December, and really into kind of January and February, Israel was making progress, not only kind of above ground, but especially below ground. And so the IDF found one, if not two, of these kind of massive tunnel complexes they believe Sinwar was hiding in. So he's kind of forced out of Khan Yunis and further south into Rafah. And really, to the best of my information, that's where he has been for, 8 or 9 months now. And that's where ultimately Israel found him, in Rafah, in this neighborhood called Tal al-Sultan. And the interesting thing is that they didn't find him in a tunnel in Rafah, in Tal al-Sultan. They found him, as we all know, above ground, kind of hiding, going from house to house. Number one, above ground, surprising. Number two, he didn't have this kind of major security detail around him. He didn't have Israeli hostages around him, thankfully. He only had 2 bodyguards with him last Wednesday, when really he was kind of spotted. The forces on the ground didn't know it was Sinwar, but he was spotted last Wednesday. And it tells you the kind of state of Hamas and really Sinwar's position after a year of war. Above ground, pretty much alone, save for these 2 bodyguards. And one of the bodyguards is actually the Hamas battalion commander for the area. So the battalion commander that should have been commanding, well, a battalion, was busy guarding his leader, his boss. And he and the other bodyguard were also killed in the ensuing firefight. And look, Sinwar thankfully was kind of found, like you said at the top, by chance, by an alert Israeli soldier. They did their job. The next day, they kind of went through the rubble, and as we all now know, were surprised themselves to find a guy dead that looked like Sinwar, and then the identification came back positive. But yeah, he died. I mean, look, in the piece for the Financial Times last November, everyone I spoke to said there was no way Sinwar was going to flee Gaza. Like some people were always asking me, has he slipped through the tunnels into the Egyptian Sinai? No. Is he going to kind of cut a deal and surrender? No. Sinwar was always going to die a violent death in the sands of Gaza. That's the kind of person he was, and he took his cue from all the previous Hamas leaders, including Ahmed Yassin, who found their deaths in the rubble of Gaza at the hands of the Israeli military.
Yeah, and it's surprising, as you noted, that he was not surrounded by hostages, as has long been believed, but there's now been DNA evidence that, at least for a time, he was with the 6 hostages that were killed in the tunnels of Rafah early last month. Exactly.
Okay, we'll be right back after this brief message.
For infographics, videos, threads, and more on critical issues impacting the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israeli politics, U.S.-Israel relations, and regional dynamics, be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can find our pages at the links in the show notes. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible and nuanced analysis, please make a gift today so that our work can continue to have an impact. Donate now at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
So, I think there's 2 sort of schools of thought that have jumped out in the days since Sinwar's death. One is that Sinwar represented the most enormous obstacle to any sort of negotiated hostage deal that would bring the war to a conclusion, and therefore his elimination could create a new opportunity to advance such a deal, versus another, which is we are talking about Hamas, which has been entirely dismantled of its leadership and perhaps its infrastructure. And it's unclear how even decisions would be made or negotiations concluded and ultimately implemented with this terrorist organization that has been so thoroughly disjointed by Israel's operations for more than a year. And I wonder, I'm sure in some ways both are true, right? That both Hamas is disjointed and also leaderless, and yet this is a new opportunity. How do you read this moment as one of opportunity to have a change in the nature of this war and opportunity to advance a deal? What do you make of how Hamas responds and how Israel responds to what is now a new chapter in this conflict?
So I agree with you, David. It is a moment of opportunity. As some people I spoke to last Thursday when this news broke, and I was on some very tight deadlines, every one of them said, this is a crossroads in the war, both for Hamas and I'd argue especially for Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I'll get to that in a second. But in terms of your initial point, yes, I think that's the great kind of unknown and unanswerable, right? Sinwar, I guess, in his last days, by no means was running an organization. He was essentially more concerned about his own survival. He wasn't running an organization, definitely wasn't reachable in any real sense of the word in terms of the international kind of diplomatic efforts to reach a ceasefire. So it begs the question, even if he hadn't been killed, could you have cut a deal with Hamas in Gaza to get the hostages out? I don't have a good answer for that, but it's something that's been on my mind as well. In terms of the actual mechanics of cutting a deal right now, I imagine if the Hamas leaders outside of Gaza, primarily in Doha and Qatar, kind of issued a statement or got word to the various elements and cells that still are surviving in Gaza that are holding the hostages that are still alive, said, okay, we've come to an agreement. These are the terms. They're agreeable and acceptable to us. I imagine you could kind of move a deal forward just in terms of kind of the technicalities of a deal. The problem is that, as I'm sure you saw, and many of our listeners also picked up on, Khalil Khayeh, a man very senior in Hamas, very close to Sinwar, essentially Sinwar's deputy, in the political wing, kind of Sinwar's mouthpiece outside of Gaza, gave a speech, A, confirming that Sinwar had been killed, but B, saying that the group was still hewing to Sinwar's demands, fairly hardline demands, and that they would not kind of soften them. And so any sense of Hamas softening its position, at least in the immediate term, was dashed when Khalil Khayeh gave that speech. Not that surprising, but definitely disappointing. Now, he would say that it's Khalil Khayeh, he's Sinwar's guy, but the more interesting question, I think, is what happens or will hopefully happen or potentially happen on the Israeli side. Killing Sinwar was a primary goal in this war for Israel. They stated it clearly. He was a dead man walking, in the words of Bibi Netanyahu and many other senior Israeli officials over the past year. And they haven't just gotten Sinwar. We have to remember, Mohammed Def also killed in recent months. Marwan Issa, the number 2 in the Qassam brigades, also killed. Many other kind of brigade commanders and senior Hamas figures inside Gaza also killed. Ismail Haniya, and so on and so forth. So there is scope, I think, for Netanyahu to come and tell the Israeli public, hey, total victory is, if not achieved, then pretty damn near close to it in terms of Israelis' point of view. And we can now maybe be a bit more flexible in our own demands that we've put to Hamas, especially in recent months, to get a ceasefire for hostage deal over the line. That's the hope. We're not quite there yet because there's the added complication of the Lebanon front, as well as a looming Israeli strike on Iran, which, when I say looming, I expect it pretty soon in retaliation for the over 180 ballistic missiles that Iran fired in Israel early this month. And so it's interesting, David. Some people I've spoken to in recent days here have said that, unlike really over the past year, where Israel was very much trying to kind of delink the various fronts, and Sinwar and Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's chief, who was also killed recently by Israel in Beirut, they were very much trying to kind of link all the fronts and wouldn't stop firing on Israel until really there was a ceasefire in Gaza. Now Israel is kind of trying to push forward a package deal that would see, I suppose, the hostages come out of Gaza and kind of wrapping up the Gaza front and finding some new and strengthened arrangement for Lebanon and really southern Lebanon and the northern Israeli border. And kind of this would obviously be after Israel struck back against Iran. And that would essentially be the conclusion of the war. That's a shift on Israel's part. I think we're in a new phase of the war in the sense that Israel, I think, and when we're talking about Israel, really, Bibi Netanyahu is, I think, for the first time really considering the possibility of ending the war, but he wants to end it on his terms. And he really wants Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran to come to the table and I don't want to say kind of surrender or capitulate, but very much soften the demands that they've put forward over the past year. And barring that, we're going to see what the academics like to call a coercive diplomacy, and what Defense Minister Yoav Gallant says, negotiations under fire. Essentially, my expectation is that in the coming weeks, we're going to see Israel ramp up the military pressure on Hamas, especially northern Gaza, on Hezbollah, all across Lebanon, against Iran directly, to basically show them that every passing day in this war, the longer it drags on, will be worse for them and their side and the axis of resistance, as they like to call themselves. Now, I think that's the plan. Whether it will work, I don't know. You're dealing with people that, how shall I put this, aren't rational in kind of our Western sense of the word. Right. They very much are true believers, ideologues, jihadists, extremists. I think many of them would rather die and see their countries burn than to, quote unquote, capitulate to Israel. And this is kind of my expectation for the coming weeks, especially since I hear that there's an election looming on your end, David. So I don't think anything really will move until Bibi has some clarity as to who the next U.S. president will be.
Yeah, I think that's all very well put, that this is a remarkable kind of Rubik's Cube of challenges on so many different fronts. But I also wonder if indeed this is a moment of opportunity, if there will be an increase in escalation in order to precipitate the possibility of bringing all these various conflicts to a conclusion. I think the question then emerges about just the nature of the Israeli government and its ability to actually bring the war to a close. A decision to end the war also gives rise to the resumption of conversations about what a day after actually looks like. And of course, any sort of negotiated hostage deal will come with a level of sacrifices, whether that's in the form of a prisoner release or other measures that members of the current Israeli government have been and continue to be adamantly opposed to. So how do you see the Israeli political system, and particularly the current government, actually seizing an opportunity to come to a close in this war?
So obviously a crucial point, because it's been a major sticking point, if not the sticking point in recent months to get a deal over the line, which is kind of domestic Israeli politics and Netanyahu's own political calculations, and really the threat by the far right elements in his cabinet, in his coalition, threatening to bring down the government if he dares end the war. Look, that's still operative. The far right extremists are still extreme. Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, we heard it even Thursday night after Sinwar's death. They said this is a moment to press on and to keep hammering Hamas till total victory. Fine, that's their position, not that surprising. What has shifted, I'd argue, is Netanyahu's own domestic political position. And really, this is a result of the major wins on the battlefield in Gaza and in Lebanon over the past month. So if we would have been talking, say, a month ago before all those beepers and pagers started blowing up in Beirut, I would have agreed with you. There's zero chance that Netanyahu risks his government to end the war and even get the hostages out. Now, I think he feels that his domestic political situation has strengthened immensely, and that he has space to run the risk of not only having his government collapse, which may or may not happen, but snap elections. Now, we're not talking about snap elections next month. This will take time. But it is interesting that the Knesset is coming back from its very, very long and indulgent recess next week. So by next week, we're going to be back in kind of Israeli political mode again during wartime, which is different, but with all the issues that are still on the table, like Haredi conscription and the battle inside Israel and inside the coalition on that issue, the budget, which is not going to be pretty for the Israeli public, that has to be passed by a new U.S. president. Again, we're not talking in the coming weeks, obviously, due to the lame duck period, but by the end of January, early February, there's going to be a new U.S. president that Netanyahu is going to have to deal with, regardless of who wins. And both Harris and Trump have given indications in their own unique ways that they'd rather this war end than continue forever. So I think he's also taking that into consideration. And yes, I can't kind of overstate this, but the Israeli public very much believes that it's winning. And some people here say, okay, this is an indication that we need to continue, even more. Fine. Right. And some people are saying that, hey, we've really kind of decimated Hamas and we've severely degraded Hezbollah, and Hassan Nasrallah and Yahya Sinwar and all these others are no longer walking the earth. This is what victory, if not total victory, actually looks like, and that you need to start winding down this war. You definitely need to get the hostages back. And Netanyahu, after the kind of disaster of October 7th, can come to the Israeli public and say, look, after a year of war, I've done all of this and I've, quote unquote, won the war for you. I've withstood, pressure from all quarters to end it prematurely in his mind.
Yeah.
And that, on the other side of an election here or not, and maybe on the other side of the US election, there may be a Saudi deal on the table.
Right.
So again, winning the war, Saudi deal.
It's a good election story. Yeah.
It's not a terrible election story.
Right.
And I think, despite his public posturing, again, coercive diplomacy, and it's a negotiation now, and I'd argue a real negotiation, but under fire, Netanyahu is smart enough to realize that another year of this, again, we haven't even talked about the north and the rockets incoming from Lebanon every day, but
right,
there's still 60,000 Israelis that haven't been kind of living at home and have been refugees in their own country for over a year now. So again, is it going to go on for another 4 months, 6 months, a year? That's less of a good election.
So Netanyahu has some serious political calculations that may or may not be impacted by the political results of the U.S. elections as well. But I want to go back to Hamas for a moment. I think there was a statement that Hamas is not going to name who their successor to Sinwar is, which sounds like a pretty good idea given they all seem to be
the short shelf life of militant leaders, terrorist leaders in the Middle East these days. Yeah,
but also, I mean, one would think that we're in a situation now where Israel is simply not going to sit by while new leadership is named, and that they won't be targeted, or that Israel will enable terrorist organizations to continue to operate along their borders, whether it's Hamas and Hezbollah, without offensive military operations. The days of assuming terrorist organizations on your borders are deterred seem to be over. So what is the future of Hamas? There's been so much talk of Hamas being an entity that cannot be destroyed, meaning an idea. Hamas is an idea. It's a political concept. Therefore, it will not go away. There have been others that would argue that the devastation and destruction of Gaza has created an entirely new generation of those who will be sympathetic. Of course, the same argument could be that an entire generation that sees Hamas's decision to attack Israel on October 7th brought horrific destruction. So perhaps this is all in the unknowable, but how do you see, at least initially, the Hamas leadership trying to reconstitute itself in the wake of this moment where you're rightly noting that Israel has tremendous momentum in the last 2 months?
So you're right. It's unknowable. I'll do my best to kind of venture guesses as to these various points, which are really the crux of the matter, right? It's not just the kind of the current moment and tactics and strategy in the coming days and weeks, but really the longer view. And the longer view, if we take it, is that this is the weakest Hamas has ever been, ever. Now, they've known difficult periods in the past, but nothing like this. And it's not just the kind of elimination of the top leadership, but really Hamas in Gaza effectively turned into the center of gravity of the organization. That wasn't a given even just a few years ago, that Hamas in Gaza, Sinwar, Def, and the others were really dictating the policy of the organization, and everyone else was kind of got in line, even if they may have had different ideas. And one person I spoke to for that FT profile late last year told me that, and he's dealt with all of these individuals, is that they actually feared Sinwar. They actually feared him, and that they would talk one way without him in the room and a very different way with him in the room. And it kind of gives you a sense of both the individual and the political leader. With him gone, there's space for something else to arise inside Hamas. I don't know if we're quite there yet, because they're also in the middle of a war. But we may see different leaders, to use a very bad term to describe Hamas leaders, but more pragmatic individuals rise up that are willing to kind of understand that they made a huge strategic error last October 7th, and that it's now time to kind of cut their losses and rebuild. That's the hope, at least.
I'm counting on a future episode of Israel Policy Pod hosted by Neri Zilber to unpack the Palestinian calculations on the political side and what that means for the future of Gaza, the future of the PA, the notion of Palestinians seeking unity and all that. I think there will be so much to unpack there.
Coming from the boss, for the record, I'll say that's a very, very good suggestion that we will definitely do in the near future. But look, going back to your question, the problem now is that Hamas in Gaza is still fighting a war and is still holding hostages. The likely successor inside Gaza is not known. It's unclear whether someone will be named. It may even be Mohammed Sinwar, Sinwar's brother, also a senior member of the Qassam Brigades, who, by all accounts, may be even more extreme and crazier than Sinwar himself was. And these people will have to make decisions as well, because they're actually holding the cards, really the only cards Hamas has, which are the hostages. And again, we may be looking at kind of fragmentation inside Hamas in Gaza. Again, how do they communicate with each other? That's also an open question. Are they communicating with each other? Is there real coordination going on? Unlikely. The politicians in Hamas on the outside will also have to kind of make their own decisions, and their various names being floated for the top spot. It's unclear whether they're going to name kind of an official public successor. And we have to remember, too, Sinwar was not chosen to be the group's overall leader after Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Tehran earlier this summer. He was essentially kind of made the de facto leader of the group. So, if it's put to a vote, the results may be very different. So again, their calculations, difficult to say. I think from the Israeli point of view, I talked about linkage earlier. Their hope is, to put it kind of very gruffly in Israeli terms, that if they hit Iran hard enough in response to that massive missile barrage a few weeks ago, that Iran will also start reconsidering the errors of their ways, will also start seriously considering cutting their losses, and Iran will actually start applying pressure on Hamas, on Hezbollah, to wrap this up. And that may kind of soften the Axis's kind of hardline positions that they've been holding for the past year. But again, it remains to be seen. And if we know anything about Bibi Netanyahu, he hasn't made any kind of decision yet. I think he's waiting to see what happens on November 5th in America, and then he'll take it from there.
Yeah, Netanyahu is known to, let's say, be deliberate in his political decision-making.
Yes, and he loves options.
Yes,
so exactly. He has the option of continuing this war forever. That's one door. The other door is kind of, working towards some kind of package deal, like I was talking about earlier. The other door is, if if the election in America goes one way, he may think that a certain Republican candidate and former president may give him more leverage come late January and February to apply even more pressure on Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas. If the election in America goes a different way, that may actually speed up Netanyahu's inclination to wrap it up.
So we need a podcast on the implications of the election, on the Iran strike, on the Lebanese day after, the question of UNIFIL, and of course Gaza day after, and the Palestinian. You're going to be a busy guy.
Yeah, it's been a busy year. Let me tell you,
it's been a busy year. That's fair. It's been a busy year,
and I can't promise anything to our listeners except blood, sweat, and tears, but also content, because there's never a dull moment here in Israel, and especially during a war going on. Always, what's your phrase, David? A lot going on.
We have a lot going on. But listen, we have a lot going on, but it is important to have you on to unpack this really monumental moment in this conflict. The world is undoubtedly a better place because the butcher of Khan Yunis is gone from this world, and the horrors and terror that he befell brought on both Israelis and Palestinians for an entire generation. I certainly hope that this brings us one step closer to the realization of seeing those hostages come home and a conclusion to this war that enables us to focus on what the next chapter of this region might look like in a way that shapes the future for the better. and appreciate your unpacking and covering all these ins and outs for us, especially when it comes to understanding this really, unrepentant terrorist that is no longer on this earth.
Yeah, and it's a good thing. And by the way, I forgot to kind of get into the ideology of it all, but it does have an impact. It does have an impact when you take out these individuals. It's not, it's not like you take someone out and it solves all your problems. But Hamas, especially in Gaza, was a mini state. Yahya Sinwar was essentially the leader of a mini terrorist state on Israel's flank. He would go and give speeches in the main square in Gaza City. He would go and observe his troops during military drills. He'd meet foreign dignitaries. All that's gone. And so hopefully, definitely for the people of Gaza and hopefully for the people of Israel, this opens up new possibilities and a more peaceful and hopeful future for everyone. We can only hope and wait and see.
Amen. Neri, I'm giving you back the host's microphone. So.
It's been a pleasure, David, and I look forward to speaking with you offline very soon. Let's just hope that everyone here and really officials and, the public too, looking on from the outside, does use this as an opportunity, as a crossroads, as an inflection point to begin to bring this war to an end.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Neri.
Thank you, David. Take care.